History is often written in ink, but the true history of America was written in sweat and blood. The year is 1854. The place is the Blackwood plantation, deep in the heart of Georgia. It was a time when men owned other men, a time when the color of your skin decided whether you were a master or a mule. And in this valley, there was only one God. His name was Colonel Arthur Blackwood. Colonel Blackwood wasn't just a plantation owner. He was a tyrant. He owned 3,000 acres of land. He owned 500 souls. But his most prized possession wasn't the cotton, nor the gold in his bank. It was the river, the Red Creek. It was a tributary of the great Mississippi that cut right through his land. It was the vein that kept the valley alive. The water fed the cotton fields, it cooled the cattle, and it kept the enslaved workers alive in the brutal, suffocating heat of the South. Blackwood was a man obsessed with control. He believed that if you controlled the water, you controlled the life force of everything that breathed. He had built a system of locks and levees upstream, a private dam made of timber and stone. With the pull of a single lever, he could flood the fields or he could turn the riverbed into dust. He called it the collar, because like a dog, he had the river on a leash. Down in the quarters, where the slaves lived in broken wooden shacks, life was a daily battle for survival. The heat in Georgia is not just hot, it is heavy. It sits on your chest like a wet wool blanket. You can't breathe, you can't think. All you can do is work and pray for sunset. Among these workers was a girl named Zoya. Zoya was 19. She was born on the plantation. She had never seen freedom. She had never seen a map, but she knew the river. She was the water girl. Her job was to run back and forth from the creek to the fields, bringing water to the workers who were fainting from dehydration. She was invisible to the masters, just another piece of property. But Zoya had something that Blackwood hated more than rebellion. She had pride. She didn't walk with her head down like the others. When the overseers yelled, she didn't flinch. And when she looked at the big white house on the hill, her eyes didn't show fear. They showed fire. It started on a Tuesday. The heat was unbearable, touching 100 degrees. Colonel Blackwood was riding his stallion through the fields, inspecting his property. He was in a foul mood. The cotton prices had dropped, and he was looking for someone to blame. He stopped his horse near the riverbank. He saw Zoya. She was knee-deep in the water, filling her buckets. The sun was hitting her face, and for a moment, she didn't look like a slave. She looked like a queen of the river. Blackwood watched her. He felt a strange, dark twist in his gut. It was a mix of admiration and disgust. He rode his horse into the water, blocking her path. "Girl," he sneered, his voice like grinding stones, "who gave you permission to drink before the horses?" Zoya looked up. She lowered her bucket. She looked at the massive horse, then at the colonel. Any other slave would have fallen to their knees and begged for forgiveness. Zoya didn't. She said quietly, "The water belongs to God, master. The horses drank their fill. Now the people must drink." The silence that followed was louder than a cannon blast. The overseers froze. The other workers stopped picking cotton. No one spoke to Colonel Blackwood like that. No one. Blackwood's face turned red. His grip tightened on his riding crop. He felt insulted. A slave girl lecturing him about God and ownership? He leaned down from his saddle, his face inches from hers. "You think this water comes from God?" he whispered, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "In this valley, I am God." He straightened up and turned his horse around. "Enjoy your drink, Zoya," he called out loud enough for everyone to hear. "Drink deep, because it might be the last drop you ever taste." No one knew what he meant. Not then. That night, the sound of hammering echoed through the valley. Up at the dam, Blackwood's private engineers were working by torchlight. They were lowering the great iron gates. They were sealing the locks. The next morning, the sun rose over Georgia like a ball of fire.
Zoya picked up her buckets and walked to the riverbank just as she had done every day of her life. But when she got there, she dropped her buckets in the sand. The river was gone. The Red Creek, which had flowed for 1,000 years, was just a bed of wet, stinking mud. Dead catfish were flopping on the drying earth. The silence was terrifying. Zoya looked up at the hill. On the balcony of the White Mansion, Colonel Blackwood was standing, watching her through a spyglass. He was waiting. The war for the water had begun.
The first reaction to the dry riverbed was not panic. It was confusion. The human mind struggles to accept that a force of nature can simply be turned off by the will of a man. But as the sun climbed higher over the Georgia pines, confusion turned to dread. The Red Creek wasn't just low, it was gone. The muddy bottom began to crack and harden under the relentless southern heat. The enslaved workers in the fields stood motionless, their hoes hanging limp in their hands, staring at the empty vein of the earth. The overseers cracked their whips, shouting for work to continue, but even they looked nervous. A plantation without water is a powder keg waiting for a spark. An hour later, that spark arrived. It wasn't water returning to the creek. It was 2 overseers marching down from the big house. They didn't go to the fields. They went straight to the slave quarters, their boots kicking up dust as they wove through the rows of shacks. They stopped in front of Zoya's cabin. Zoya was inside, tending to her father, old Rahim, whose hands were gnarled from 50 years of picking cotton. When the door burst open, Rahim tried to stand, shielding his daughter, but the lead overseer shoved him back onto his straw mattress with the butt of a rifle. "Sit down, old man," the overseer spat. "We ain't here for you. The colonel wants the girl." Zoya stood up slowly. She knew what this meant. To be summoned to the big house was rarely a blessing. Usually, it was a sentence. She smoothed her rough burlap dress and stepped out into the blinding sunlight. The walk to the mansion was a mile long, uphill. It was a walk between 2 worlds. Behind her was the dust and the smell of sweat. Ahead of her was the scent of magnolias and manicured lawns. As she crossed the threshold of the main gates, she felt the eyes of the other workers on her back, a mix of pity and fear. They thought she was walking to her doom. Inside the mansion, the air was shockingly cool. The thick brick walls and high ceilings kept the Georgia heat at bay. Zoya was led into the master's study, a room lined with leather-bound books and trophies of animals Blackwood had hunted. And there, sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, was Colonel Blackwood. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't holding a whip. He was calm, swirling a glass of amber whiskey. But on the corner of the desk, sitting on a silver tray, was a crystal pitcher filled with something Zoya hadn't seen in years: clear, ice-cold water. Beads of condensation were dripping down the glass, pooling on the expensive wood. "You look thirsty, Zoya," Blackwood said, his voice smooth like oil. He gestured to the pitcher. "Georgia's summers are unforgiving. A man could die of thirst out there today." He poured a glass of water. The sound of the ice clinking against the crystal was sharp in the silent room. He pushed the glass towards the edge of the desk, towards her. "Go on, drink. It's fresh from the cistern, clean, cold." Zoya stared at the glass. Her throat was parched, her lips were cracked. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to grab it, to gulp it down. But she saw the look in Blackwood's eyes. This wasn't charity, it was a transaction. "Why?" asked Zoya, her voice raspy. "Why do you offer me this?" Blackwood stood up and walked around the desk, leaning against it casually. "Because I am a benevolent master," he smiled, though his eyes remained cold. "I have a proposition for you, Zoya. You see, I have locked the river. The dam is sealed. By tomorrow, the cattle will start dying. By the day after, your people down in the quarters will be too weak to stand. But I have the key. I can open the gates. I can let the river flow again." He took a step closer to her, invading her space. "I own you, Zoya, body and soul. Admit it. Drink the water, thank your master, and I will open the river. Refuse, and the valley dies." It was a devil's bargain. He was using the lives of 500 people to break the spirit of one girl. He didn't just want her obedience, he wanted her surrender. He wanted to prove that her dignity had a price, and that price was a glass of water.
Zoya looked at the condensation dripping from the glass. She thought of her father back in the hot, airless shack. She thought of the children crying in the quarters. Then she looked Blackwood in the eye. She saw the smugness there, the absolute certainty that he had won. Zoya stepped back. She wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "My father is thirsty," she said softly. "My people are thirsty. But if I drink from your glass, I drink their blood." She turned around and walked towards the heavy oak doors. "Keep your water, master. We will wait for rain." Blackwood's smile vanished. His face twisted into a mask of fury. He slammed his fist onto the desk. "There will be no rain," he roared. "I control the sky here. Do you hear me? If you walk out that door, you condemn them all." Zoya didn't stop. She didn't look back. She opened the door and stepped back out into the suffocating heat. Inside the study, Blackwood stood shaking with rage. He grabbed the crystal glass of ice water and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall, sending shards of glass and water exploding everywhere. He had offered her life, and she had chosen suffering. He walked to the window and watched her small figure walking back down the hill towards the slave quarters. "Fine," he whispered, his voice trembling. "If they want to thirst, let them burn." The first reaction to catastrophe is usually denial. The human mind is wired to reject the impossible, and the idea that a man could simply turn off a river like a faucet was too big, too monstrous to accept. So for the first 24 hours, the slave quarters didn't panic. They got to work. You have to admire their spirit, at least in the beginning. As the sun beat down on the drying mud of the Red Creek, the men of the plantation grabbed shovels and pickaxes. They thought if they dug deep enough, if they pierced the skin of the Georgia red clay, they would find the groundwater that surely must still be flowing beneath the rocks. It was a frantic, desperate energy. Hundreds of men stripped to the waist, sweating profusely, hacking away at the riverbed. But the geology of the valley was cruel. The Red Creek wasn't just water flowing over the land, it was the source that fed the water table. With the dam upstream blocking the flow completely, the pressure dropped. The water didn't just stop moving, it retreated. It sunk deep into the fractured limestone, far beyond the reach of a shovel. By sunset on that first day, all they had achieved were holes filled with brown, sludgy muck. It wasn't water, it was wet clay. You couldn't drink it, you couldn't give it to the mules. If you tried to filter it through a cloth, it still tasted of sulfur and dead fish. That night, the reality began to set in. The plantation wells, which were usually brimming, began to make a hollow sound when the buckets were dropped down. They were drying up. The veins of the valley were collapsing. Zoya stayed inside her shack. She barred the rough wooden door. She could hear the sounds of the digging outside, the shouting, the frustration. Every sound felt like an accusation. Her father, old Rahim, sat in the corner, clutching his worn Bible. He didn't speak. What could he say? He knew the choice his daughter had made, and he knew the price the community was paying for it. He was proud of her spirit, yes, but pride is a dry thing. It doesn't quench thirst. "Daddy," Zoya whispered, bringing him a small tin cup of water from our storage jar. It was tepid and stale. "Drink."
"If you die, then the master wins." That was the battle line now. It wasn't about water anymore. It was about will. The second day brought the heat, and I don't mean normal heat. Rahim pushed it away gently. "Save it for yourself, child. I am old. I do not need much." "Drink," Zoya insisted, her voice, I mean a silent, suffocating oven. Without the cooling evaporation of the river, the humidity dropped. The air became sharp. It sucked the moisture right out of your skin. This is where the psychology of the crowd began to shift. You see, hunger makes people angry, but thirst makes people mad. It attacks the brain, it clouds judgment, it strips away the veneer of humanity layer by layer. The animals were the first to suffer. The plantation had hundreds of horses and cattle. These animals need gallons of water a day. By the afternoon of the second day, the cattle began to low, a deep, mournful sound that echoed off the hills. It was the sound of suffering. They were licking the dry troughs with sandpaper tongues.
Some of the men tried to give them the muddy sludge from the riverbed, but the animals just vomited it back up, making them even more dehydrated. And then the whispering started. It began behind the shacks and near the cookhouse, where people were gathering not to eat, but to worry. "Why should my mule die because she is too proud?" a field hand asked, slamming his fist into his palm. "Blackwood is a devil, yes, we know this, but the devil has offered a deal." "It is a sin," another man argued, "to give a girl to him. It is against the Lord. It is against our dignity." "Is it dignified to let your children die of thirst?" the field hand shot back. "My boy is crying for water. He has no tears left, but he is crying. Is Zoya's virtue worth more than my son's life?" This is the terrible genius of Colonel Blackwood's plan. He didn't have to whip the slaves himself. He didn't have to fire a single shot. He simply created a situation where the oppressed would turn on each other. He turned morality into a luxury they could no longer afford. Zoya felt the shift when she went out to the communal trough that evening. She had pulled her headscarf tight, hoping to go unnoticed. She just wanted to see if there was any water left at the bottom, just a cup for her father. As she approached the trough, the chatter stopped. A group of women were gathered there, scraping the bottom of the wood with metal cups, trying to salvage the last drops. When they saw Zoya, they straightened up. These were women who had known her since she was a baby, women who had braided her hair on Sundays, women who had sung spirituals with her in the fields. Now their eyes were hard. They looked at her like she was a stranger, or worse, a curse. "Ain't no water here for you, Zoya," one of the women said, her lips cracked and bleeding. "I just need a little for my father. He is sick." "We are all sick," the woman snapped. "My baby is burning up with fever. Why? Because you are stubborn." "It is the master doing this, not me," Zoya cried out. "Why are you angry at me? Be angry at him." "We cannot reach him," the woman screamed, pointing up at the white mansion on the hill. "He is up there, drinking ice water on his porch. You are here. You have the key to the lock, Zoya. You can turn the river back on. You just choose not to." "He wants to break me," Zoya said, tears welling in her eyes, precious tears she couldn't afford to waste. "He wants to take my soul. Would you send your daughter? Would you send yourself?" The woman hesitated. For a second, the shame flickered in her eyes, but then the sound of a child crying in a nearby shack pierced the air. The woman's face hardened again. "If it saved the plantation, yes, I would go. I would crawl on my hands and knees." She spat on the dry ground near Zoya's wheat. "Go away. Do not come back to this trough until you have fixed what you broke." Zoya ran back to her shack. The isolation was absolute. She wasn't just fighting the master now. She was fighting her own people. That night, Caleb came to her door. He was a strong man, a blacksmith on the plantation, who had loved Zoya since they were children. But tonight, he looked terrible. His skin was gray with dust, his eyes sunken. He had been working all day trying to dig a new well, to no avail. "Zoya," Caleb rasped through the wooden planks, "open up." She opened it and pulled him inside. They hugged, clinging to each other like drowning sailors. "Caleb, they hate me," she sobbed into his chest. "They want me to go to him." Caleb held her face in his rough, calloused hands. "I know. The talk is getting bad, Zoya. The elders are talking tonight. They are discussing dragging you up there themselves." Zoya froze. "Forcing me?" "They're saying that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one," Caleb said, his voice trembling with rage. "They are scared. Fear makes men do terrible things." "What should I do?" she asked, looking into his eyes for an answer. "Should I go? Caleb, tell me, if I go, will you still look at me the same way? Will you still love me?" It was a question that hung in the hot, stagnant air. If she sacrificed herself to the monster in the big house, could she ever come back? Could she ever be Zoya again, or would she just be the master's leftover scrap? Caleb closed his eyes. He loved her. He wanted to say, "No, never go." He wanted to be the hero who said, "We will die together." But he was also a man who had seen his own mother collapse from heat stroke that afternoon. I don't know," he whispered, the shame burning him. "I don't know what the right answer is anymore." That answer broke Zoya's heart more than the insults of the women at the trough. Even Caleb, his strong Caleb, was wavering. The thirst was stripping away his resolve. Up on the hill, Colonel Blackwood was documenting the process. He kept a journal. He wrote about the breaking of the spirit as if it were a science experiment. He noted that by day 3, the social bonds were collapsing. He noted that the slaves were no longer looking up at his house with anger. They were looking at Zoya's shack with hatred. He sat on his veranda as the sun set, casting long, blood-red shadows across the Georgia Valley. He had a spyglass set up. He could see the slave quarters. He could see the gathering of the elders. He took a sip of his bourbon and water, the condensation dripping on his hand. "Come on," he whispered to the darkness. "Bring her to me." The breaking point came on the morning of the 4th day. The first human died. It wasn't a strong field hand or an elder whose time had come. It was a child, a 3-year-old boy named Elijah. He had been weak before the dam was sealed, suffering from a summer fever, but without water to cool him down, without hydration to fight the infection, his small body simply shut down. He died in his mother's arms, just as the sun came up over the cotton fields. The wail of the mother was a sound that tore through the slave quarters. It was a primal scream of loss that woke everyone up. It woke Zoya up. She lay on her straw mattress, her eyes staring at the wooden ceiling, and she knew instantly what that sound meant. It was the sound of a debt coming due. Within an hour, a crowd had formed. This wasn't a group of neighbors anymore. It was a beast with many heads. They didn't carry weapons. They carried their grief and their thirst. They gathered outside Zoya's shack, their feet kicking up the red Georgia dust. There were hundreds of them, men, women, even children. Their faces were masks of desperation and fury. "Zoya!" a voice roared. It was Big Moses, the foreman of the field hands. "Come out, girl." Zoya stood in the center of her small room. Her father, old Rahim, tried to stand up, grasping his cane, but he was too weak from dehydration. He fell back on his cot. "Do not go," he wheezed, clutching his Bible. "Let them kill us, but do not go to the master." But Zoya couldn't hide any more. She unlatched the door. She pushed it open. The heat hit her like a physical blow, heavy and suffocating, but the hatred of the crowd was hotter. "Elijah is dead," the mother screamed from the front of the crowd, holding the limp body of her child wrapped in a sheet. She held it up like an offering, like evidence in a trial. "Look, look at what your pride has done." "I did not kill him," Zoya shouted back, her voice raspy and dry. "The master killed him. Blackwood did this." "And you can save the rest of us," Moses shouted. "The colonel gave us a choice. You are the choice. Why are you so special, Zoya? Are you an angel? Is your virtue made of gold? We are dying here." The mob surged forward. A clod of dry dirt flew through the air. It hit Zoya on the shoulder, a sharp burst of pain. She stumbled back, clutching her arm. "Go to him," the mob chanted. It started low, a rumble, and then it grew. "Go to him. Open the river." Caleb pushed his way through the crowd. He stood in front of Zoya, his arms spread wide, trying to be a shield. "Stop!" he screamed. "Are you animals? She is one of us. If you force her, you are doing the master's work for him." "Get out of the way, Caleb," Moses warned, stepping closer.
"We want to live," Moses said, lowering his eyes, unable to hold her gaze. "Fine," Zoya said. "I will go." A collective sigh of relief went through the crowd. It was a disgusting sound. It was the sound of people selling their souls and feeling relieved about the price. "But know this," Zoya said, pointing a trembling finger at them. "The water you drink today, it will taste of blood, every drop of it. You will drink and you will live, but you will never wash this stain from your hands." She didn't pack a bag. She didn't say goodbye to her father. She couldn't bear to see the look of shame in his eyes. She simply started walking. The mob parted for her, creating a path. They didn't touch her. They were afraid to touch her, as if her sacrifice made her holy and cursed at the same time. She walked through the quarters, past the dry trough, past the dying cattle, and onto the gravel road that led up the hill. She walked alone, the walk of the condemned. Up on the hill, Colonel Blackwood watched through his spyglass. He saw the small figure detach from the crowd and start the climb. He smiled. He closed the spyglass with a satisfying snap. "Silas," he called out to his house servant, "prepare the bath. She is coming." The road from the quarters to the mansion was only a mile long, but for Zoya it felt like crossing an ocean. Every step was a battle against gravity and conscience. The dust of the valley gave way to the paved cobblestones of the plantation drive. The deeper she walked into the estate, the more the world changed. It was cruel, really. Down below, the air was yellow with dust and smelled of death. But up here, the air was clear. The lawns were impossibly green, watered by the private cistern. There were magnolia trees, their white flowers blooming and fragrant. Zoya looked at them and felt a strange, cold numbness. Those flowers were drinking the water that should have saved the child, Elijah. She clutched her side, where she had hidden her father's old carving knife beneath the folds of her burlap dress. It was a small, rusted thing, used for cutting rope and peeling potatoes. It wasn't a weapon of war, but against her skin, the cold metal felt like the only friend she had left in the world. When she reached the main steps, the house servants were waiting. They opened the heavy double doors without a word. They couldn't look her in the eye. Even the house slaves, who lived better than the field hands, felt the shame of this day. Zoya stepped through. The heavy doors closed behind her. There was no turning back now. She was led upstairs to the master bathroom. It was a room larger than her entire family shack. In the center was a porcelain clawfoot tub filled with steaming, scented water. There were towels that looked softer than clouds. "Wash," the housemaid whispered, tears in her eyes. "He says you must be clean before he sees you." Zoya stood alone in the room. She looked at the bath. It was a trap. It was designed to make her feel human again, to soften her, to make her forget the anger. If she washed off the dust of the fields, she would be washing off her identity. She would become just a pretty doll for the master. She walked to the mirror. She looked at her reflection. Her face was streaked with red Georgia clay. Her lips were cracked. Her eyes were hollow. She looked like a ghost. She didn't undress. She didn't step into the bath. Instead, she dipped her hand into the water. It was warm. She splashed a little on her face, just enough to clear her eyes. Then she reached under her dress and checked the knife again. It was still there. She sat on the edge of the tub and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, the door opened. It was Blackwood. He stood in the doorway, wearing a fresh linen suit, a glass of bourbon in his hand. He looked at her, still fully dressed in her rags, still dusty, sitting on the unused bath. He frowned slightly. "You didn't bathe." Zoya stood up. She gripped the folds of her dress, her hand hovering near the hidden knife. "I did not come here to bathe, master. I came here for the trade." Blackwood chuckled. He stepped into the room. "The trade? You make it sound like business, Zoya. It's so cold." He walked around her, inspecting her like he was buying a prize mare at an auction. "I wanted to treat you like a lady, but you cling to your dirt, don't you?" "I cling to who I am," Zoya said. "And who are you?" Blackwood asked, stopping in front of her. He was close now, too close. He could smell the alcohol on his breath.
You are a girl who has nothing, no water, no future, no hope, except for me." He placed his glass on a side table. He reached for her shoulders with both hands. "Say it," he whispered, his voice thick with obsession. "Say that I am your master." Zoya looked up at him. This was the moment. The entire history of the valley had led to this second. She could see the triumph in his eyes. He thought he had broken her. He thought the dust and the thirst had taken her spirit. She took a deep breath. Her hand tightened around the handle of the rusted knife beneath her clothes. "You are the master of this land," she said softly. Blackwood smiled, his ego swelling. He relaxed. He let his guard down. "But," Zoya continued, her voice hardening like steel, "you are not the master of my soul." And then she moved. It happened in the blink of an eye. The stillness of the room was shattered by the flash of rusted metal. Zoya pulled the knife from the folds of her burlap dress. Blackwood flinched. He stumbled back, his boots slipping on the polished floor, his eyes widening in genuine fear. He thought she was going to kill him. For a split second, the arrogant master vanished, replaced by a terrified man facing a cornered animal. He threw his hands up, shouting, "Help! Silas! Guards!" But Zoya didn't lunge at him. She knew better. If she killed a white man in Georgia, the overseers wouldn't just kill her. They would burn the entire slave quarter to the ground. There would be no mercy. Everyone she loved, Caleb, her father, the children, would be executed. No, she couldn't kill the monster, but she could kill his victory. If this story shocked you, make sure you're subscribed.
Blackwood froze. His hands were still raised in defense, but his face went slack with shock. He watched as a bright red stain blossomed on Zoya's chest, spreading rapidly across the rough fabric of her dress. She didn't scream. She simply exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that carried the last of her strength. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed onto the cold bathroom floor. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was the dripping of the faucet that Blackwood had prepared for her bath, a cruel irony, water flowing freely while life drained away. Blackwood stood over her, trembling. He wasn't trembling with grief, he was trembling with rage. He looked at her body not as a tragedy, but as a stolen possession. She had robbed him. She had denied him the one thing he wanted, her submission. By choosing death, she had remained free. The door burst open. Silas, the house servant, and two overseers rushed in, alerted by Blackwood's shout. They stopped dead in their tracks. They saw the colonel standing there, unharmed, and the field girl lying in a pool of blood. Silas fell to his knees beside her. He touched her hand. It was still warm, but the life was gone. Zoya, the water girl, was dead. She did it herself," Blackwood stammered, his voice high and unnatural. He looked at the overseers, desperate to control the narrative. "She was mad. The heat took her mind." But Silas looked up. There were tears in his eyes, but underneath the tears there was a look of pure hatred that he usually kept hidden. He saw the knife. He saw the piece on Zoya's face. He knew exactly what had happened. She hadn't lost her mind. She had found her freedom. Blackwood looked around the room, breathing heavily. He felt small. He felt defeated. The girl was dead, and with her his leverage over the plantation had evaporated. He couldn't threaten a corpse. He couldn't negotiate with a ghost. In a fit of impotent fury, he kicked the basin of water, sending it crashing to the floor. "Get her out of here," he screamed, his voice cracking. "Drag her out! Get this filth out of my house!" The sun was beginning to set when Silas carried Zoya out of the big house. The Georgia sky was a bruised purple, casting long, twisted shadows across the plantation lawns. It was a heavy walk. Zoya wasn't a large girl. Hunger and work had kept her thin, but to Silas she weighed 1,000 pounds. He wasn't just carrying a body, he was carrying the conscience of the entire valley. He walked down the winding gravel driveway, past the overseers who lowered their rifles and averted their eyes, and out onto the dust road leading to the slave quarters. Down below, the field hands were waiting. They had gathered at the edge of the quarters, shielding their eyes against the dying sun.
They were parched, their lips peeling, their bodies weak from days without water. But they were hopeful. They had sent Zoya to the master. They had paid the price. They expected to hear the roar of the returning creek any minute now. When they saw Silas approaching, a murmur went through the crowd. "He is coming," someone rasped. "Is that Zoya with him? Why is he carrying her?" As Silas got closer, the murmur died. The silence returned, that thick, suffocating silence. They saw the limpness of her arms swaying with Silas's steps. They saw the dark, wet stain covering the front of her burlap dress. Silas reached the edge of the crowd. He didn't say a word. He walked to the center of the gathering, right to the spot where the mob had forced her to leave just hours ago. He knelt down in the red dust and gently laid her body on the ground. Zoya looked peaceful. The pain was gone from her face. She looked like she was sleeping, except for the terrible red wound in her chest. Caleb, the blacksmith, broke through the line of people. He fell to his knees beside her. He didn't scream. He was too dehydrated to cry. He just let out a dry, broken sound, like a branch snapping in the wind. He touched her face, his hands shaking violently. Big Moses stepped forward. "What happened?" he whispered. Did the master do this?" Silas looked up. His eyes were burning with a rage that terrified Moses. "No," Silas spat. "You did this. You and your thirst. She chose death rather than let him own her. She died to keep the dignity you tried to sell." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. The workers looked at each other. The shame hit them harder than the heat. They had pushed an innocent girl into the fire to save themselves, and she burned. "But the water?" a woman asked weakly from the back. It was a selfish question, a horrible question, but it was the only thing keeping them alive. "The water is coming, but I do not think you will want to drink it," Silas said, standing up. Up on the hill, Colonel Blackwood was standing on his veranda. He was watching the scene through his spyglass, but his hands were shaking so much he couldn't focus. He felt sick. He felt a terror he had never known, the terror of a slave master who realizes he has lost control. The girl's death had turned the quarters against him in a way rebellion never could. She had become a martyr. He saw the way they looked at her body. He saw the way they looked up at his house. It wasn't fear anymore. It was judgment. He grabbed the bell rope on his porch and rang it frantically, summoning his head overseer. "Jones," he screamed, "ride to the dam. Blow the locks. Now." "But, Colonel," the overseer shouted back from the lawn, "we haven't cleared the debris. The rush will be too strong."
"I said blow it," Blackwood roared, his voice tearing at his throat. "Give them their damn water. Wash it all away." The sound of the explosion hit the valley like a thunderclap. Up at the dam, the overseers had packed black powder charges against the timber locks. When the fuse burned down, the blast shattered the silence of the night, sending splinters of wood and chunks of stone flying into the sky. The dam groaned, a terrible mechanical sound of wood snapping under immense pressure, and then, with a roar that shook the ground, it gave way. Down in the quarters, the ground trembled. The people looked up. They heard it before they saw it. It sounded like a freight train barreling through the woods, a low, grinding rumble that grew louder by the second. The Red Creek was coming back. "Water!" someone shouted. "It's coming!" Panic turned into a frenzy. Men and women who had been too weak to stand just moments ago scrambled toward the dry riverbank. They held out tin cups, buckets, even their cupped hands. They fell to their knees in the mud, their eyes wide with desperation. They were ready to drink. They were ready to wash the dust from their throats. Then the water arrived. It didn't flow like a gentle stream. It crashed down the creek bed in a violent, churning wall. And it wasn't blue. It wasn't clear. Because the river had been dammed for days, the bottom was covered in silt and loose red clay. When the massive surge of water hit that dry clay, it churned it up instantly. The torrent that smashed into the slave quarters was a thick, opaque soup of deep, dark red. In the fading light of the evening, it looked exactly like fresh arterial blood.
The wave surged over the banks, flooding the lower parts of the quarters. It washed over the spot where Silas had laid Zoya's body. The red water swirled around her, mixing with the actual blood that stained her dress, until you couldn't tell where the river ended and the girl began. The first man to reach the water was Big Moses. He plunged his face into the rushing current, desperate for relief. He gulped down a mouthful, choking and sputtering. He pulled his head back, gasping for air, water dripping from his beard. He froze. He looked at his hands. They were stained red. He looked at the water in his cup. It was thick and crimson. He looked at Zoya's body, now half submerged in the rising flood. He retched. He threw the cup down and scrambled back up the bank, wiping his mouth frantically. "Blood!" he gagged. "It's blood!" The crowd recoiled. The psychological horror of the moment hit them all at once. They had traded Zoya's life for water, and now the river had returned as a torrent of blood. It was a sign, a biblical curse. Mothers grabbed their children and pulled them back from the edge. Men stood staring at the rushing red water, their thirst screaming at them to drink, but their souls screaming at them to stop. "It is the price," Caleb whispered, standing over Zoya's body as the water lapped at his boots. "She said it. She said we would drink her blood." For a long, agonizing minute, no one moved. The water was right there, thousands of gallons of it, enough to save the cattle, enough to save the crops, enough to save them. But they couldn't touch it. The guilt was too visceral. It felt like cannibalism. Up on the hill, Blackwood watched the red snake of water wind its way through his land. He saw his workers backing away from the banks. He realized with a sinking heart that he had broken something that could never be fixed. He had given them what they wanted, but he had poisoned it with martyrdom. Finally, a young boy, no older than 10, broke the spell. He was delirious with heat. He didn't understand the politics or the symbolism. He just knew he was dying. He crawled to the edge of the red water and drank. He didn't die. He didn't turn to stone. He just drank, weeping, gulping down the muddy red sludge. Slowly, one by one, the others followed. They had no choice. They were human, and humans must drink to live. But they didn't drink with joy. There was no celebration, no splashing. They drank the red water, and with every drop, they swallowed the memory of the girl who lay dead in the mud beside them. They survived the night, but the Zoya of the river was gone, and the Blackwood plantation had changed forever. The fear that had kept them docile was washed away by the red tide. In its place, something harder, colder, and more dangerous began to take root. The dawn that followed the return of the river did not bring the sun. It brought a heavy gray mist that clung to the Georgia pines like wet cotton. The valley was silent. The roar of the water had settled into a steady rhythmic gurgle, but the sound was no longer soothing. It was the sound of a wound bleeding out. They buried Zoya just as the mist began to lift. There was no discussion about where she would rest. The slave cemetery lay 3 miles to the east, a patch of rocky ground marked by crude wooden crosses that rotted within a season. But Zoya did not belong to the rocks. She belonged to the water. Without waiting for orders from the overseers, Caleb and Silas walked to the riverbank, the very spot where the red flood had washed over her body the night before. The ground was changed. The flood had deposited layers of silt and iron-rich clay from the riverbed. The earth wasn't brown. It was a violent, visceral crimson. It looked like raw meat. When Caleb drove his shovel into the ground, the sound was wet and heavy. He didn't cry. His tear ducts had run dry days ago. He simply worked, his muscles coiling and releasing, digging a grave into the bleeding side of the river. The entire population of the quarters stood behind him, 500 souls. They stood in a semicircle, pressing close but leaving a respectful distance from the body. Zoya lay on a simple wooden plank, washed clean of the blood, but still wearing the burlap dress she had died in. Her face was pale, almost translucent against the dark red mud, but her expression was untroubled. The agony of the thirst was gone. The rage of the confrontation was gone. She looked like she was merely listening to the river flow. Big Moses stood at the front of the crowd, a man who had survived 30 years of the whip, a man who thought he had seen every cruelty the South could offer. But this broke him. He looked at his own hands, still stained faintly red from where he had cupped the water the night before. He looked at the grave. He realized that every breath he took from this day forward was a gift purchased with this girl's life. "We should say words," a woman whispered. It was the mother of Elijah, the child who had died of thirst. "Someone needs to pray." But no one moved. The Bible in old Rahim's hands remained closed. What prayer fits a moment like this? To thank God for the water felt like a sin, for the water was poisoned with guilt. To ask for forgiveness felt futile. So they gave her the only thing they had left, their silence. It was a silence heavier than the heat. It was a silence that screamed. It traveled up the hill, past the cotton fields, through the manicured gardens, and settled like a shroud over the white mansion.
Silas and Caleb lowered her into the red earth. They didn't use ropes. They reached down with their bare hands, placing her gently into the cold mud. As they began to fill the grave, the red dirt covering her face, the sun finally broke through the clouds. It didn't sparkle. It glared. It turned the red creek into a ribbon of fire. When the last shovel of dirt was patted down, Silas stood up. He turned to the crowd. He didn't look like a house servant anymore. He looked like a prophet of doom. "Drink," he said, his voice raspy. "Go to the river and drink. Survive, because we have to be alive to see what comes next." The rotting of the house of Blackwood. The change in the plantation was not immediate, but it was absolute. In the weeks that followed, the cotton turned white and burst from the bolls. It was a bumper crop, the best harvest in a decade, fed by the revitalized water table. But when the overseers rode into the fields to drive the workers, they found something terrifying. The fear was gone. For generations, the Blackwood plantation had run on terror, the crack of a whip, the threat of the sale, the fear of the dark box. But how do you frighten men and women who have already drank blood to survive? How do you break people who have already watched their savior die and then went back to work with dry eyes? The workers moved through the fields with a slow, mechanical precision. They didn't sing. The famous spirituals of the Georgia fields, the songs of Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and Go Down Moses vanished. The fields were dead silent, save for the rustle of cotton plants. When an overseer yelled, the workers didn't flinch. They simply stopped, looked up, and stared. They stared with the same flat, dead eyes that Zoya had shown the master. It was unnerving. It was unnatural. One by one, the hired overseers began to quit. "It ain't right here," the head foreman told Colonel Blackwood one evening, twisting his hat in his hands. "The air, it smells like iron all the time, and them slaves, they look through you, Colonel, like you ain't even there. I can't whip a ghost, sir. I'm leaving." Colonel Arthur Blackwood did not beg him to stay. In fact, Blackwood barely heard him. The colonel had retreated. The day Zoya died, something in his mind had fractured, a hairline crack in a porcelain vase that slowly, inevitably spreads until the whole thing shatters. He had won, technically. The girl was dead, the river was flowing, the crop was saved. But every time he poured a glass of whiskey, he saw the condensation dripping down the side, and he remembered the bath. He remembered the sound of the knife entering flesh. He remembered the way she had looked at him, not with submission, but with a pity that burned worse than hate. He became obsessed with the bathroom. The master bath, with its imported Italian marble and gold fixtures, became his entire world. He was convinced there was a stain. The servants would hear him late at night. Scrub,
Scrub, scrub, the sound of a bristle brush grinding against stone. He would be on his hands and knees, scrubbing the spot where Zoya had fallen. "It's still pink," he would whisper to Silas, his eyes wide and bloodshot, sweat dripping from his nose. "Do you see it, Silas? The grout, it's drinking the color. It keeps coming back." "There is nothing there, master," Silas would say, his voice devoid of emotion. Silas took a dark pleasure in these moments. He would stand in the doorway, holding a fresh bucket of water, watching the man who thought he was a god reduce himself to a frightened cleaner. "Liar!" Blackwood would scream, hurling the brush across the room. "It's under the stone. It's seeping up. Get me lye. Get me acid." He stopped eating. He stopped shaving. The crisp white linen suits that were his trademark turned yellow and stained. He forbade the servants from opening the curtains. He claimed the sun was too loud. He claimed the river was mocking him. The plantation began to crumble around him. With the overseers gone and the master mad, the work in the field slowed to a halt. The cotton, unpicked, began to rot on the stalks. The gray moss on the oak trees grew longer, draping the avenue in ragged shrouds. The paint on the mansion peeled, exposing the gray wood beneath. But the worst torture was the sound. Blackwood became convinced that the plumbing of the house was haunted. He could hear water running in the pipes, a constant thrumming vibration in the walls. Drip, drip, drip. Even when he shut off the main valve, the sound continued. It was the sound of the river. It was the sound of Zoya's blood. One night in the winter of 1855, Silas found Blackwood standing on the balcony in the pouring rain. He was screaming at the dark valley below. "Take it back!" Blackwood shrieked, his voice tearing against the wind. "I give it back! Stop the flow! I command you to stop!" But the Red Creek roared on, swelling with winter rain, indifferent to his commands. The collar was broken. The dog was off the leash. The end of the era. Colonel Blackwood died 2 years later. It was not a glorious death. There was no duel, no last stand. Silas found him slumped over his desk in the study. He had tried to write a letter, perhaps a confession, perhaps a will, but the ink had spilled across the page, forming a black Rorschach test that looked suspiciously like a river delta. His heart had simply stopped. The coroner said it was heart failure brought on by acute alcoholism. The people of the quarters knew better. They knew that a heart can only hold so much darkness before it implodes. They buried him in the family crypt, but no one visited. The weeds grew high around the iron gates of the cemetery. The mansion, now empty of its master, stood like a hollow skull on the hill. Then came the war.
In 1861, the world broke open. The Civil War was not just a battle of armies, it was a reckoning. When the Union troops finally marched into Georgia, they brought with them the fire. General Sherman's march to the sea was a broom that swept the South clean, and the Blackwood plantation was directly in its path. But the soldiers didn't have to burn the mansion. Legend says that when the Union cavalry rode up the long, weed-choked driveway in 1864, they found the house already burning. The fire had started from the inside. Some say it was Silas, taking one last act of revenge before disappearing into the night to find his freedom. Others say it was an accident, a candle left burning by a looter. But the elders of the quarters whispered that it was the house itself committing suicide. It was purging the rot. The slaves, now freedmen and freedwomen, stood by the riverbank and watched it burn. They saw the roof collapse. They saw the great white pillars, monuments to slavery, crumble into soot and ash. The flames reflected in the water of the Red Creek, turning the river orange and gold. When the fire died down, there was nothing left but the brick chimneys, standing like blackened tombstones against the dawn. The chains were broken. The master was dead. The house was dust. But Zoya remained.
The legacy of the water. Time is a relentless eraser. It rubs away the details of history until only the broad strokes remain. 100 years passed, then 150. The cotton fields were reclaimed by the forest. The pine trees marched back in, covering the furrows where the blood and sweat of generations had fallen. The ruins of the slave quarters melted back into the earth, leaving only mounds of dirt and the occasional rusted nail to show they had ever existed. The chimneys of the Blackwood mansion eventually fell, pulled down by ivy and gravity. Today, if you hike through that dense Georgia forest, you might stumble upon a pile of old bricks, moss-covered and forgotten. You might find a fragment of Italian marble, strangely out of place in the wilderness. But the river never forgot. The Red Creek still flows. It is a quiet stream now, popular with fishermen and hikers who know nothing of the year 1854. They sit on the banks, drinking beer, laughing, unaware that they are sitting in a graveyard. But there is one spot that the locals avoid after dark. If you follow the creek 3 miles downstream from where the old dam used to be, you will find a clearing. The trees here are old, ancient, majestic oaks with limbs as thick as factory smokestacks. One tree in particular leans out over the water, its roots exposed like gnarled fingers gripping the red clay. It is Zoya's tree. There is no headstone. The wooden plank rotted away a century ago. But the people of the valley, the descendants of Moses and Caleb and Silas, they have not forgotten. Every year, on the hottest day of July, when the heat haze shimmers off the asphalt and the cicadas scream in the trees, someone comes to this spot. They don't announce themselves. They don't bring a priest. They come alone, usually at twilight. They bring a piece of cloth. Sometimes it is silk, sometimes cotton, but it is always bright red. They tie it to the lowest branch of the oak tree, letting it dangle just feet above the rushing water. Over the years, the branch has become covered in them, hundreds of red strips, fading in the sun, weathering in the rain, fluttering in the wind. They look like leaves that refuse to fall. They look like drops of blood suspended in mid-air. There is a legend in the nearby town. The old folks say that if you sit by that tree on the anniversary of the day the river died, you can hear things. They say that if you listen closely, past the sound of the wind and crickets, you won't hear the weeping of a ghost. Zoya does not weep. She was done weeping before she died. No, they say you can hear the sound of a knife snapping shut. You can hear the sound of a lock breaking, and most distinctly of all, you can hear the voice of a young girl, clear and cool as ice water, whispering the words that broke a dynasty. You are the master of this land, but you are not the master of my soul. The river flows on, washing the red clay downstream, carrying the story of the girl who watered the valley with her life all the way to the ocean. And in the end, that is the only history that matters. The stone crumbles, the iron rusts, the names of the masters are forgotten. But the water remembers everything.
History is often written in ink, but the true history of America was written in sweat and blood. The year is 1854. The place is the Blackwood plantation, deep in the heart of Georgia. It was a time when men owned other men, a time when the color of your skin decided whether you were a master or a mule. And in this valley, there was only one God. His name was Colonel Arthur Blackwood. Colonel Blackwood wasn't just a plantation owner. He was a tyrant. He owned 3,000 acres of land. He owned 500 souls. But his most prized possession wasn't the cotton, nor the gold in his bank. It was the river, the Red Creek. It was a tributary of the great Mississippi that cut right through his land. It was the vein that kept the valley alive. The water fed the cotton fields, it cooled the cattle, and it kept the enslaved workers alive in the brutal, suffocating heat of the South. Blackwood was a man obsessed with control. He believed that if you controlled the water, you controlled the life force of everything that breathed. He had built a system of locks and levees upstream, a private dam made of timber and stone. With the pull of a single lever, he could flood the fields or he could turn the riverbed into dust. He called it the collar, because like a dog, he had the river on a leash. Down in the quarters, where the slaves lived in broken wooden shacks, life was a daily battle for survival. The heat in Georgia is not just hot, it is heavy. It sits on your chest like a wet wool blanket. You can't breathe, you can't think. All you can do is work and pray for sunset. Among these workers was a girl named Zoya. Zoya was 19. She was born on the plantation. She had never seen freedom. She had never seen a map, but she knew the river. She was the water girl. Her job was to run back and forth from the creek to the fields, bringing water to the workers who were fainting from dehydration. She was invisible to the masters, just another piece of property. But Zoya had something that Blackwood hated more than rebellion. She had pride. She didn't walk with her head down like the others. When the overseers yelled, she didn't flinch. And when she looked at the big white house on the hill, her eyes didn't show fear. They showed fire. It started on a Tuesday. The heat was unbearable, touching 100 degrees. Colonel Blackwood was riding his stallion through the fields, inspecting his property. He was in a foul mood. The cotton prices had dropped, and he was looking for someone to blame. He stopped his horse near the riverbank. He saw Zoya. She was knee-deep in the water, filling her buckets. The sun was hitting her face, and for a moment she didn't look like a slave. She looked like a queen of the river. Blackwood watched her. He felt a strange, dark twist in his gut. It was a mix of admiration and disgust. He rode his horse into the water, blocking her path. "Girl," he sneered, his voice like grinding stones, "who gave you permission to drink before the horses?" Zoya looked up. She lowered her bucket. She looked at the massive horse, then at the colonel. Any other slave would have fallen to their knees and begged for forgiveness. Zoya didn't. She said quietly, "The water belongs to God, master. The horses drank their fill. Now the people must drink." The silence that followed was louder than a cannon blast. The overseers froze. The other workers stopped picking cotton. No one spoke to Colonel Blackwood like that. No one. Blackwood's face turned red. His grip tightened on his riding crop. He felt insulted. A slave girl lecturing him about God and ownership? He leaned down from his saddle, his face inches from hers. "You think this water comes from God?" he whispered, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "In this valley, I am God." He straightened up and turned his horse around. "Enjoy your drink, Zoya," he called out loud enough for everyone to hear. "Drink deep, because it might be the last drop you ever taste." No one knew what he meant. Not then. That night, the sound of hammering echoed through the valley. Up at the dam, Blackwood's private engineers were working by torchlight. They were lowering the great iron gates. They were sealing the locks. The next morning, the sun rose over Georgia like a ball of fire. Zoya picked up her buckets and walked to the riverbank just as she had done every day of her life. But when she got there, she dropped her buckets in the sand. The river was gone. The Red Creek, which had flowed for 1,000 years, was just a bed of wet, stinking mud. Dead catfish were flopping on the drying earth. The silence was terrifying. Zoya looked up at the hill. On the balcony of the White Mansion, Colonel Blackwood was standing watching her through a spyglass. He was waiting. The war for the water had begun.